Working off the coast of Liberia in West Africa, we were on patrol with the Liberian Coast Guard on board when we came across this ship, a ship that we knew had a license to legally fish in Liberian waters, using long-line fishing gear to target tuna. But once on board, the Liberian Coast Guard, supported by Sea Shepherd, assisted by Sea Shepherd, discovered that this vessel wasn't using long lines to target tuna. They were using deep-sea gill nets, these invisible curtains of death, to target endangered sharks for their livers to produce shark liver oil. They discovered that this vessel, Libico II, was on 3 international blacklists under its previous name. We learned that in the 1990s, this ship was part of a fleet of 50 Spanish-owned vessels that absolutely devastated the North Atlantic, targeting endangered deep-sea sharks. These 50 vessels, every single month, would lose about 1,500 kilometers of fishing net as ghost net that they wouldn't be able to recover, that they wouldn't be able to find, that would just drift and drift and drift until they would finally wash ashore somewhere, maybe years and years later, killing every single day until they did. And that length of net, 1,500 kilometers of ghost net, that equates to 750 tons of marine plastic pollution every single month just by this fleet of 50 ships and in the form of ghost nets. We very nobly decide to say no to plastic straws and other single-use plastic. This is plastic that's specifically designed to kill marine wildlife, and losing fishing gear at sea is factored into the economics of business.
We have the absolute honor and pleasure of having with us Captain Peter Hammarstedt, from the Sea Shepherd. I'm sure all of you know about it. He's going to definitely tell us more about Sea Shepherd and its mission. Thank you very much for being here again. Peter, the floor is yours.
Hello, Athens. I'm so excited to be back here. I was here a few months ago to speak at a TEDx Athens event, and in that time I fell in love with this city. And as a vegan of 20 years, I still remember when it used to take me 30 minutes to drive to a place where I could get powdered soy milk. So to be at an event like this, the largest vegan event in Europe, with almost 40,000 people attending, is a really, really big honor. And I'm so grateful for all of you showing up here tonight to listen to me speaking about the oceans and to speak about Sea Shepherd. I wanted to start by talking about a creature that moves at speeds of up to 100 kilometers an hour, the speed of about a cheetah. The largest individual of this kind found in nature weighed 900 kilos. That's the weight of a male grizzly bear. These creatures are warm-blooded, like us, but unlike us, they're endangered. Most people have heard of the plight of megafauna like rhinos and elephants, but few people have heard of the plight of the Mediterranean bluefin tuna, even though its numbers have fallen by 97% in just the past 50 years. And the reason for that is that the bluefin tuna is a fish, and their home is the ocean. Even within the vegan movement, fish get the least amount of advocacy. In our vegan outreach materials, fish are always on the last page, at best an afterthought, at worst simply a footnote. We even have a word for people who are vegetarian in every aspect of their food life, except that they still eat fish. We call them pescatarians. And yet there isn't a word for somebody who is vegetarian but still eats pig, or somebody who is vegetarian and still eats cow. And yet despite this lack of advocacy and activism, more than twice as many fish are killed every single year as all other animals combined, over 2 trillion of them. And I would argue from an ethical standpoint that no slaughter of animal is more cruel in its methodology and more wanton in its destructiveness, where animals are either frozen to death or crushed to death by the weight of other individuals piled on top of them. So the question is, why don't people care about fish? And I've reduced it to 4 main reasons. And firstly, it's because the oceans are out of sight and out of mind for most people. Sir Paul McCartney once said that if slaughterhouses had glass walls, then everybody would be vegetarian or vegan. Now imagine that those slaughterhouses were hundreds or thousands of miles offshore, accessible only by boat. People aren't seeing what's happening to fish. Secondly, fish don't have vocal cords. When we're in pain or when other mammals are in pain, they're able to scream. Air moves from our lungs, through our throats, past our vocal cords, and out our mouths. But fish breathe using gills, and therefore they have no vocal cords, and although they have the same capacity to suffer as you or me, their screams are silent. Thirdly, fish don't have eyelids, and that seems like a ridiculous reason not to give ethical consideration to another living creature. But eyelids and eyelashes and eyebrows is something that we humans share in common with other mammals. When Disney Pixar made the film Finding Nemo, they hired the best animal behaviorologists, the best marine biologists, to ensure that the sea creatures in that animated film moved as realistically as possible. That's why Nemo's father is so protective over his son, because clownfish in the wild are naturally very paternalistic. But the one difference between the animated creatures in Finding Nemo and their real-life counterparts is that they have eyelids and they blink. And the Disney animators had to add those eyelids in order for the audience to empathize with them, to feel any compassion for them. And lastly, the reason people don't care about fish is because language is always used to justify slaughter. We see it all the time with animal agriculture. That's why when people go to the supermarket, they buy bacon, they don't buy pig. They buy beef, they don't buy cow. And no industry has been better at using language to justify slaughter than the fishing industry. Within fishing, we don't talk about fish populations, we talk about fish stock, as if these fish were simply taken off the shelf of a warehouse. Fish aren't stabbed to death or netted to death. Fish are harvested as if they were simply apples being picked off the tree in an orchard. And when we talk about the amount of fish killed every single year, it's never in number of individuals. It's always by weight, in tons. And so in one single sentence, we can say that X ton of fish stock was harvested. So there's no surprise that people feel a disconnect between the fish that end up on plates and the fish that end up out at sea. Thankfully for fish, there is Sea Shepherd. And because Sea Shepherd is relatively new to Greece, I thought it would be helpful for me to talk about what Sea Shepherd is and why we are unique and different from every other marine conservation organization out there. Sea Shepherd Global is based out of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and we run a fleet of ships that are operating in every ocean to use direct action to protect marine wildlife. And the way that we do that is different from any other group. Firstly, we're not a protest organization. Sea Shepherd is a direct intervention organization, and we work with law enforcement to do it. All along the African continent, we're teamed up with countries that have a Coast Guard, they have a Navy, but they don't necessarily have the vessel assets that can adequately cover the entirety of their waters. And so we, thanks to the generous support of all of you, provide the ship, the crew, and the fuel, and our government partners provide the Coast Guard and Navy soldiers with the authority to board and arrest vessels. And in the past several years, we've assisted 8 countries around the African continent to arrest 80 vessels for illegal fishing and other fisheries crime. And every one of those vessels arrested is a slaughterhouse that's shut down. The metrics, how we measure success, is what makes us unique. We don't measure our success by the number of reports that we put out every year. We don't put out any. We don't measure our success by the size of our membership. We have a small but very dedicated and passionate support base. We measure our success by two criteria: the number of criminal operations that are shut down and by the number of lives that we save. And that's fishing vessels arrested, and every day that one of these vessels spends detained in port is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of lives saved. If we step aside from the ethical issues, from a conservation standpoint, we absolutely have to care about fish. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the UNFAO, state that 90% of the world's fisheries are either fully exploited or overexploited, meaning that just 10% of the world's fisheries are healthy. It's difficult for us to imagine how bountiful, how rich the oceans once were in marine wildlife, because every single generation adapts to a diminished ocean. When large sailing tall ships arrived off the North American continent in the 1700s, ship captains wrote in their logbooks that there was so much cod, that there was so much fish, that a bucket could have been thrown overboard and pulled back on deck just full of fish. Some captains wrote that there was so much cod in the water that they could have almost walked to shore by walking along the backs of fish. We read these accounts, we hear these stories, and we think that they're an exaggeration because we can't imagine that amount of fish offshore. But the reality is that there are so many different accounts like this from different fleets and different countries with no ability to communicate quickly and effectively that they're likely to be true. It's just that what should be a normal state for the oceans seems like an exaggeration when the oceans are already so emptied. It's estimated that there's half the amount of fish in the world's oceans today than there was 50 years ago. Shark populations, tuna populations, fallen by 90% of what they were 50 years ago. And driving this, exacerbating this, making this worse, is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, so-called IUU fishing. It's believed that 20% of the global catch of fish is caught by illegal fishing operators, meaning that 1 out of 5 fish caught is caught illegally. So for Sea Shepherd, if we want to deal with the overfishing problem, well, with the legal fishing business, with the ethical issues, the conservation issues, we have to deal with that through outreach. But with the illegal fishing operations, we can team up with governments with the political will, but that may have challenges with the economic resources to deal with that particular problem. And if we want to deal with overfishing, then we can absolutely start with illegal fishing, where we already have the laws in place to take out 20% of the global fishing effort once and for all. I was always a whale person. That's what motivated me to join Sea Shepherd 20 years ago. And yet what I learned is that while countries like Japan, Iceland, and Norway targeted by harpooning over 3,000 whales every single year, over 300,000 whales and dolphins were being killed every single year as they were caught in fishing gear, caught on hooks, and caught in nets. And so I learned after spending 10 years working against whaling down in the Antarctic that whaling was not the root problem facing the world's oceans. Whaling was symptomatic of a more problematic relationship that we have with our oceans. And what really brought that issue home for me was when I came across the most notorious, the most infamous illegal fishing vessel in the world, a ship called Thunder. About 15 years ago, illegal fishing was so prevalent down in the Southern Ocean, down in the Antarctic at the bottom of the world, that 1 out of 3 fish was caught illegally. A fleet of ships was able to act undetected by changing their name, they would change their flag, they would change their color scheme constantly. a customs and border protection plane would fly over one of these vessels. They would document their illegal fishing activity. And as soon as that plane was over the horizon, the ship would already be operating under a new name. They had steel nameplates on the ship that they could just flip and turn around like James Bond license plates. One of those ships, called Thunder, had evaded justice for over 10 years, making a profit of $60 million in that time, and no government anywhere was able to stop that vessel. And so at Sea Shepherd, we came up with an idea that was so simple that it had never been attempted before. The plan was to set sail from Australia and New Zealand with 2 of our ships, to find the Thunder in the most remote area of water in the world, a place 2 weeks sailing from the nearest port. And on finding that ship, we would follow it wherever it went for however long it took until somebody somewhere arrested the ship. As long as we had our eyes on Thunder, they couldn't change their name. They couldn't change their flag. We were going to be this searchlight, lighting up their criminal enterprise, exclaiming to the world, this is where they are, right here, right now, somebody somewhere arrest this ship. Took about 2 weeks to get to the area where we eventually found Thunder coming out of the fog after just 2 days of searching, a ship that nobody had seen in 10 years. And what would begin then, which we didn't know then, was the longest maritime chase in history, covering 110 days, 3 oceans, and over 11,000 nautical miles. The first thing that Thunder tried to do when we found them was to try to lose us in the heavy ice floes that surround the frozen continent of Antarctica. But we were able to follow by just tracing the warm line that the Thunder drew through the ice in front of us. Their next strategy was to try to lose us in the heavy storms that the Southern Ocean is renowned for. As we moved up north, 6, 7, 8-meter waves beat and battered my ship Bob Barker as we followed Thunder through the bad weather. Their next strategy, after we got through that storm system, was to test our patience and to try to wait us out. They shut down their engine to conserve fuel and only burnt the fuel that their generator was consuming for the lights on board the ship. We shut off our engine as well and began what we would later call the Great Drift. For weeks and weeks and weeks, we drifted together, staring at each other from bridge to bridge using binoculars. I remember asking my chief engineer how much fuel we had, and through some quick calculations determined that if Thunder drifted indefinitely, then we could drift with them for up to 2 years if it came to that. But thankfully, after 2 months of drifting, Thunder started moving again. They moved up north, up the west coast of Africa, until finally, after 110 days, about 80 nautical miles outside of the island state of Sao Tome and Principe in West Africa, Thunder began to sink. And the captain of Thunder, unable to shake us as his pursuer, decided to sink his own vessel to destroy the evidence on board. After 110 days of chasing one another, our crews had to rescue the crews of Thunder and turn them over to law enforcement in Sao Tome, but the ship, with its evidence on board, would disappear forever. When we handed the Thunder crew over to the Sao Tomean Coast Guard, we met them in the port of Sao Tome, and the Coast Guard came out in 2 small boats at about a length of 12 meters, with a range of about 20 miles, a quarter of the distance to where the Thunder sank. So the captain of Thunder knew that no Coast Guard or Navy was going to be able to come out and save his ship. He decided to sink his ship in the waters of West Africa for the same reason why this area is a hotbed of drug trafficking, human trafficking, illegal fishing, transshipment, namely that there's inadequate monitoring, control, and surveillance. And so months after Thunder sank, we started working with West African governments to turn that tide of destruction. I mentioned earlier that we've assisted 8 countries around the African continent to arrest 80 vessels for illegal fishing, 80 illegal slaughterhouses shut down. And I think the best way to illustrate the destructiveness of these vessels and the effectiveness of this methodology is to talk about one of these ships, a ship that I will always remember, a vessel called Libico II. Working off the coast of Liberia in West Africa, we were on patrol with the Liberian Coast Guard on board when we came across this ship, a ship that we knew had a license to legally fish in Liberian waters, using long-line fishing gear to target tuna. But once on board, the Liberian Coast Guard, supported by Sea Shepherd, assisted by Sea Shepherd, discovered that this vessel wasn't using long lines to target tuna. They were using deep-sea gill nets, these invisible curtains of death, to target endangered sharks for their livers to produce shark liver oil. They discovered that this vessel, Libico II, was on 3 international blacklists under its previous name. We learned that in the 1990s, this ship was part of a fleet of 50 Spanish-owned vessels that absolutely devastated the North Atlantic, targeting endangered deep-sea sharks. These 50 vessels, every single month, would lose about 1,500 kilometers of fishing net as ghost net that they wouldn't be able to recover, that they wouldn't be able to find, that would just drift and drift and drift until they would finally wash ashore somewhere, maybe years and years later, killing every single day until they did. And that length of net, 1,500 kilometers of ghost net, that equates to 750 tons of marine plastic pollution every single month just by this fleet of 50 ships and in the form of ghost nets. We very nobly decide to say no to plastic straws and other single-use plastic. This is plastic that's specifically designed to kill marine wildlife, and losing fishing gear at sea is factored into the economics of business. So effective was this fleet of 50 ships that after just 3 years, the number of deep-sea sharks in the North Atlantic fell to 20% of the pre-fishing number. And so the European Union kicked this fleet out. So the fleet relocated to the Bay of Bengal off India, where they wiped out deep-sea sharks. They then relocated to the Mozambique Channel between Mozambique and Madagascar, where they wiped out deep-sea sharks. And now the discovery of Libico II, working secretly in the waters of Liberia, meant that these poachers had made their way to West Africa. On board this ship, we found paperwork that showed that every 3 weeks, this ship was offloading about 50 tons of shark liver oil in the port of Dakar in Senegal. And to produce 50 tons of shark liver oil takes the lives of 66,000 deep-sea sharks, which meant that this one single ship that nobody knew about was killing 500,000 sharks every single year. The vessel was arrested by the Liberian Coast Guard. It was escorted back to port where it was detained. And now, 4 years later, the Libico II has still not gone out to fish at all. Which means that this one single action by the Liberian Coast Guard, supported by Sea Shepherd, supported by people like you, was able to shut this vessel down and save over 2 million sharks and counting. And in the time that I've been talking here, more and more sharks have been saved by that one action alone, and this is just one out of 80 vessels that have been arrested. And it convinces me that there's no more effective way to save the maximum number of animals than arresting illegal fishing vessels. The numbers are just phenomenal. But I think there's a tendency within the vegan movement to sometimes go toward abstraction. And although I'm very, very proud that over 2 million sharks have been saved, I think when numbers get that big, there's a risk that people stop thinking about the individual animals and start thinking about them as if they're statistics. And that's why I always try to think about that success as being 2 million sharks times one shark, one individual. And I always try to think about any direct action that I've done with Sea Shepherd within the context of an experience that I had 12 years ago off the coast of Australia. The year was 2010, and there was a stranding of 54 pilot whales on a small remote island called King Island, just off of Australia. 5 crew and myself, we got on a plane to go and assist the Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife Service to get those pilot whales back out to sea. By the time we arrived, all 54 pilot whales had been brought out to sea, but one of them had re-stranded herself. She ended up back up on the beach. And the weather took a turn for the worse, which meant that another effort couldn't be made to reintroduce her back to the ocean. For over 3 days, my crew and I worked tirelessly to keep that one single pilot whale alive. We set up shields to protect her from the wind. We poured buckets of water over her to keep her skin moist. And we covered her with wet blankets to prevent her skin from getting sunburned. My job was to measure her breathing, and I stood there next to her with a stopwatch. And from day one, her breathing started getting slower and slower, from breathing out of her blowhole once every 30 seconds to once every 2.5 minutes. Her breath started smelling like old curdled milk, which is a sign that she was severely dehydrated. But finally, after 3 days, there was this short window of 2 hours where there was a break in the weather. And so we quickly, 20 of us, grabbed her in blankets and began to carry her down to the beach to release her back out to sea. We had a rope underneath her fins and 2 jet skis that were used to pull her off the beach and tow her out to sea. But as we got about 200 meters off the beach, she began to struggle loose from this tow line and began to swim in a completely different direction from where we were taking her. And our fear on the beach was that she was about to re-beach herself and that she might not survive another rescue effort. But thankfully, there was a helicopter in the air. And the helicopter reported that she was swimming toward the other 53 pilot whales that had been released 3 days earlier. They'd been waiting for her, knowing that she was still stuck on that beach. And as she met that pod of pilot whales, they circled her, they butted their heads together, and then once together, all 54 of them swam out to open ocean as one pod. These are incredibly complex creatures with big social structures, big families, and when you draw that line to also encompass fish species, fish who also grieve, fish who also have families, then you really realize the challenges that we face. That's why I'm so proud of these missions that we're able to do thanks to your support. Because with the arrests of these illegal fishing boats, it's millions and millions of creatures saved times one individual sea creature. Now, Sea Shepherd is relatively new to Greece, but thanks to the leadership of Valia, our Sea Shepherd Greece coordinator, we already have an operation in Alonissus, and some of the crew, like Captain Marino, are here today. And these operations have already started saving marine wildlife, working together with the Greek Coast Guard to protect the largest marine protected area in the Mediterranean. And so if you're like me, and you're motivated by animal ethics, and you're motivated by saving the environment, and you want to measure your success by the number of lives that you're able to help save, then I sincerely encourage you to donate to Sea Shepherd and support Sea Shepherd, but also to speak to Valia, who's in the front row, and to join a growing movement of ocean conservationists here in Greece. But I also think that Sea Shepherd has a very particular and special role to fill within the vegan community, because I really feel that Sea Shepherd is a bridge between the conservation movement and between the animal rights movement. And it's a critical bridge that needs to be built and a critical bridge that needs to be crossed. Within the animal rights scene, within veganism, we oftentimes talk about speciesism, or the discrimination against an individual because of their species. And I firmly believe that the front line of that confrontation with speciesism is focusing on fish. Because there's no greater way to challenge the idea of speciesism than to fight for the creatures that on the surface seem the least like us, which is fish. So I hope you'll join me and become a fish advocate. I hope that you'll join Sea Shepherd Greece and be on the front lines of marine protection efforts here in the Mediterranean. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about Sea Shepherd, about fishing, about illegal fishing. And I'm just so grateful to spend this evening with you. Thank you so much.